Reading this morning is taken from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through to 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zaccheus. He was chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zaccheus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be guest of a sinner." But Zaccheus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." This is the word of the Lord.
So this is just the story we might have heard about this person in Sunday school or even in holiday club. I wasn't a Christian when I was a young kid, but I remember when I became a Christian, I helped in holiday clubs, and they used to sing about this guy. Zaccheus was a very little man. A little man was he, something like that. And actually at school, I was the smallest out of 150, but I had a growth spurt when I left. So I can understand what it means to be short. So this is a short story about a short man. And I'll probably keep it short as well. But it's just, there is something in this story. And the key verse I felt was verse 5, "Zaccheus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." But in this story, there's 3 things just to bring across. And Kate likes me to bring 3 things. So I will bring 3 things. The first thing was that as Jesus walked into Jericho, this is the place which the walls fell down, and in the Old Testament they walked around and the walls fell down. He walked into Jericho, and Zaccheus had obviously heard about Jesus, and he wanted to see him. He wanted to hear him, but because he was short, he couldn't get to the front of the crowd. So he climbed this tree. Amazing, isn't it? He climbed this tree. But in that verse I just said, Zaccheus, so Jesus knew his name. I don't know how he knew his name, but is that the first point really to maybe get across is that God knows each of our names. He knows each of our names. And he knows everything about us. It says in Job that before you were born, I knew you. And it's not a condemning way he looks at us. He just knows everything about us. He knows our hearts. He knows what's going on in our lives. He knows us, but he called out Zaccheus' name. That might have been a shock. He was up this tree, and he just called out his name. And he knew Zaccheus obviously was seeking him, obviously climbing a tree. Zaccheus wanted to know Jesus. He wanted to know about Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus. And maybe he was quite undignified by climbing this tree. Zaccheus was known in Jericho. He was the chief supervisor, tax collector. And as such, he was despised by everybody. because he worked with the Romans. He was seen as a traitor. He was a crook. He extorted with taxes, and he lived an opulent lifestyle. So he wasn't very popular. But he was seeking Jesus, and he climbed that tree to see Jesus. He was hungry. And it is often when we're hungry for God, when we're seeking God, that's when he meets with us. So when we seek him, he comes to meet us. But that invitation is always his invitation to us, isn't it? He's the one who called out to Zaccheus to come. And he does that with each of us, whatever our situation or circumstance, whether we know him or we don't know him, he calls out to us. And actually, the Hebrew meaning of his name means clean and pure. So the lifestyle he was living wasn't clean, it wasn't pure, because he was taking advantage of people. But God knows our name, and he calls things, it says in Romans 4:17, God calls what is not as if it were. So he called his destiny for Zaccheus was to be pure, was to be clean. And so it's like and that's what he does in our lives. He calls what is not in our lives as though it were. His plans, his purposes for us, he calls those things forth. And it may be you've been given a prophetic word at some stage in your life. And that's possibly for all of us, and maybe had some word spoken over us, and we haven't necessarily seen it take place. Often we go through a difficult time before that word can take place. There's like a contention for that word. But what he says, he knows what's in our hearts, but he just encourages us with his words of love to come. So this is who you can be. This is your identity. This is your true identity. I like looking at the meaning of names. My name, Simon, means one who listens and one who obeys. That's the hardest bit, is to obey. But that's what it means. But I know, and people have prayed over me different times a year, different times, is I'm on a journey to become Peter. And Simon's a bit more fickle, and Peter's more solid. He was also known as Rocky, wasn't he? So that's what I believe God wants to work in me, is to be more stable, more rooted in him. So he knows our name, and he loves us, but he knows our name. And just last thing with that is he's also the God, in the Old Testament it says he's the God who sees. Hagar was in the desert and she was crying out, thinking God had forgotten her, but he's the God who sees. He sees our situation. He hasn't forgotten us. He loves us. And the second thing just to bring out, I just feel, is he said to Zaccheus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Another version it says, I have been appointed to stay at your house today. And to me, I felt actually it fitted in with what that picture that someone had in this team meeting about Jesus standing and saying, come. But he's saying, I want to come into your house today. And to someone like Zaccheus, that he must have been very grateful, because everyone seemed to hate him. It maybe seems everyone's against us. But he was saying, Zaccheus, God has said, I must come and stay with you today. This is your hour. This is your appointed time. And as a guest, he would eat and stay overnight. And he was welcomed with joy. But it said in the passage also, the others grumbled. They were the religious people and the Pharisees. And often, actually, we can be like that. We can see somebody who we don't feel deserves that favor of God coming to stay with them or being lifted up. So sometimes we can look at other people and think, why is it that God is favoring them Why has he chosen them? Tax collectors and sinners. That's often who we see Jesus was going to meet with and spend time with. That doesn't compute with our religious mindset sometimes. I remember this evangelist was saying he once was at Wimbledon and he felt called to go and speak to Boris Becker when he was Wimbledon champion. So he went and he just barged through and said, "Boris, can I speak to you?" And Boris took him to a table and they had a chat. And he just shared about Jesus with him. Unfortunately, Boris, I don't believe, has become a Christian because, bless him, he got in debt and different things. But that was maybe his appointed time to hear God. So he does. He knocks on the door of our hearts and he says, "Come." Sometimes we don't feel worthy, but he says, "Come." And we can choose to listen or we can choose to put up walls. But there is often an appointed time, a time to come to him, a time he welcomes us. And I often think also of, got pictured in the stable there, the Holman Hunt. "Behold, I stand at the door," Revelation 3:20. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, fellowship with him." And in a way, that's what I feel was happening with Zaccheus. He was knocking on the door of his heart. And Zaccheus welcomed him with joy. And he opened the door and Jesus came in. And because of that, he was really blessed and touched. And that's maybe what he's doing with us today, is saying, "I'm just knocking at the door of your heart." And maybe there's like a lot of ivy on the outside of the door. Maybe it hasn't been open for ages, or maybe we shut the door in an area of our life which is painful, or we feel shame. But he's knocking at that part of our lives. So just in this second part, will we welcome him today with joy into our hearts, into our lives? It says, "I want to come in to your house today." And our house is our heart, isn't it? Will we welcome him with joy? And are there any rooms we're ashamed to show him? Is there a basement where we push things down, or things that have happened that we don't want to face? We fear to let him in. Is there pain, unforgiveness, a sense of not being good enough? I'm sure actually with Zaccheus, there were all those areas that he was willing to let. He made the choice, and sometimes it's just a choice for Jesus to come in. And the third thing from this passage is that spending time with Jesus changes us, and we want to give to him and to others. And we read in this story that Zaccheus joyously welcomed Jesus and was amazed over his gracious visit to his home. He just felt blessed to have Jesus come in. Zaccheus stood up in front of the Lord and said, "Half of all that I own, I will give to the poor. And Lord, if I have cheated anyone, I promise to pay back 4 times as much as I stole." And that was out of a thankful heart, wasn't it? He was touched by Jesus' love. And when we spend time with Jesus, that changes us. When we spend time with Jesus, then we can sense his love. We can see his love. I was just thinking of another tax collector, which we all know, Levi, who wrote the book of Matthew, in Luke 5. And he's similar in that once again, the Pharisees grumbled and judged. And it was actually him who invited Jesus into his house this time. Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners, those who don't measure up, to repentance, to come back to God and not turn away." And we know what happened with Matthew as well. he became one of the disciples. And the other thing, just, I don't know if some of you may have seen The Chosen, and the way Jesus is portrayed in there is very loving. And it's just really, he's someone, although it says in the Bible that there was nothing of himself that draws us to him, but actually the words he speaks are spirit and life. There was something in a way that drew people to him. And he wasn't a party pooper, as it were. People enjoyed being with him. They were, so, at this table there would have been other tax collectors and sinners. So his presence, there was something about his presence that attracted people who didn't feel good enough, people who felt they'd fallen short of the mark. People wanted to hear him. And that's his character. He wants to speak words to us that are spirit and life. That's who he is. And then that response, he said to Jesus, I'll give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I cheated anyone back, I'll pay them back 4 times. I wonder if he had much left after this, because maybe he had done a lot wrong. But that is really a heart response, isn't it, when we meet with Jesus? That everything else pales into significance. And we want to be clean. When we meet someone, when we meet him in his holiness, which is his mighty awe and his love, he wants us to give to him and to give to others. And as Cheryl actually read that last verse as well, it says, for the Son of Man did not come to seek and save. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost. And that's for people who don't know Jesus. But it's also when we feel lost, and sometimes we can feel lost, we can feel we're far away from God. So he's come to seek and save us. And he calls us by name. He wants us to know.